Has the Mandela Effect become so big that it can no longer be covered up, at least like it used to be? Let's take a look and find out.
Open your eyes. I said I'm sad.
Hello, welcome to the Nothing Is As It Seems podcast. This is episode 1. My name is Mark. I'm your host. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to be talking about the Mandela Effect. And my experience is that the powers that be are no longer able to contain this thing. Some of what I'm about to share has never been covered, at least in the aggregate. So even if you've previously looked into this thing or been a student of it or studied it extensively, some of it will be new for you. This is a pretty big subject. And in fact, I could probably do a weekly show for like the next 5 years on the experiences that I've had in Mandela Effect ministry and the things that I've learned. I'd probably never touch the bottom of it. So for now, I'm going to lay a foundation. I'm going to give you some of my background, how I got into Mandela Effect ministry, some of the things that I've seen, and of course, some of the evidences that they are losing control of the narrative and they're no longer able to cover it up like they used to. So let's just go back to when I first heard about this. I heard about this a little bit later than most. A lot of people have a testimony that it was around 2014, 15, 16, 17, thereabouts, where they heard about it. For me, it was like 2019. And I heard about the Berenstain Bears, Oscar Mayer. I heard about the North Pole never having an ice cap. That was a big one for me. I don't want to give you too many examples here because you've probably already heard them if you're listening to this in the first place. Luke, I'm your father. The biggest Mandela effect for me ever was the color chartreuse. I remember it as a reddish pink. I couldn't believe when I saw that it had never been that color. It had always been green. I went through all of the mental processes that most people have gone through. The first thing I thought of, they must have scrubbed the internet. They must have changed the internet. They didn't change history. That was the last thing on my mind, right? And then I heard about the Bible changes. And that was the real mind blower. That was like level 1 in the scariness chart. And the Bible change that got me was the Lord's Prayer had never said, "Forgive us our trespasses." Now, this show is not a ministry, but I am a Christian. I'm a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. So everything that I'm going to give you is going to come from that perspective. That's how I see things. That's how I see this. That's how I see pretty much everything. But I didn't actually become a believer until my mid-30s. However, my grandmother was one of the people that had planted some seeds. And when I was a child, very young child, she used to pray the Lord's Prayer with me at night. And I knew what she said. I knew that she said, "Forgive us our trespasses. You're not going to tell me any differently." And I was like, no way. And that was like the beginning of me looking into this thing. And I looked a little deeper, I looked a little further, very scared, felt very isolated. And I was a member of a 501c3 church at the time. And one of the first things I did was to contact my pastor. And I set up an appointment and we had a phone conversation about this. Now, this is the interesting part, because that was, little did I know then, that was going to be the first conversation that I had with pastors about this, of many. And we'll get into that further later in the show. But of all the conversations that I've had with pastors about the Mandela Effect, this one was probably the weirdest that I've ever had. And it started out with him trying to give me examples of why I was wrong. We make mistakes, we misunderstand things, we hear one thing, but it really said another. And basically the very familiar argument that I was misremembering. Okay. However, I had recently heard a sermon of his where he used Hosea 4:6, and he stated that scripture the way that most of us remember it. My people perish for lack of knowledge. not my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And I pressed him on that issue and some other issues. And what he did was very interesting because he did like an about face. And instead of saying, I was wrong about the misremembering, or instead of doubling down on the misremembering, he kind of pivoted. And he tried to convince me that my focus was in the wrong place. So basically, it went from I'm totally wrong, I'm crazy, and people like you are crazy, to you need to focus on something totally different. Don't put your focus here. Don't think about this. Don't ask about this. Don't talk about this. It was a fairly long conversation. And probably about 3/4 of the way through the conversation, I'm saying to myself, now I know that this is true based upon the way that he is responding. So he was trying to put a damper on my enthusiasm for learning or trying to learn the truth about this. But the conversation had the opposite effect because I knew that the way that he handled it, it seemed like he was just trying to cover it up. Now, here's the interesting thing. And now we're going to get into what I would say would be level 2 of the scariness factor. I eventually ran into a ministry that covered the Mandela Effect. That was Scott Johnson's contendingfortruth.com. And by the way, before I continue, that this is one of only a very small handful of ministries that I would recommend checking out. I've had the opportunity to email with Scott a few times. He's a really good guy. I really like him. I trust him. Out of all the people that I've ever covered, he's probably the person that I'm just about positive, not just about, I am positive that he is not controlled opposition. And we're going to talk a lot about controlled opposition on this show, not today. But anyway, I ran into a Mandela Effect teaching by Scott Johnson on contendingfortruth.com. And according to Scott, the Baptist faith in the state of Missouri held a conference or convention of some kind, and they called all the preachers and leaders together in a separate room off the record. And this was in 2012, by the way. And in this separate room off the record, supposedly the pastors and leaders were told that the congregates were going to start coming to them and asking them about Bible changes, aka the Mandela Effect, and that they were to deny these Bible changes, and that they were to blame these Bible changes on confusions with the different translations. Okay, if you're not a Christian, that the Bible has different translations in English. You have like the KJV or King James Version, which you may have heard of, the NIV, the NLT, ESV. There's a lot of them. NALT. Anyway, that's what they were told to blame it on. So they knew about this in 2012, and they were ordered to cover it up. And apparently, that's what they did. There was a Facebook group, and there was some guy on there who supposedly had his life threatened. It was shared by this pastor, Sherry Sowell, who I eventually ran into in ministry, and we'll get into that later. And it's just, am I able to confirm it 110%? No, I'm not, because I wasn't there in 2012, and I wasn't a part of that Facebook group because I didn't run into it until years after the fact, and the group no longer exists, etc., etc., etc. But it's mind-blowing information, and it just so happens to mirror exactly what I experienced when I became a part of a Mandela Effect ministry, which is coming. I'm getting to that part of the story. Now, if you want to check this out for yourself, the name of the organization that hosted the convention is called the BMA. That's short for Baptist Missionary Association. And apparently they told the leaders in that convention that if enough people saw the Bible changes, that they would leave the church. And of course, I don't think that they meant church in the sense that Jesus meant church when he said, upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I think they were talking about the 501c3 buildings, their tithes, their positions, their authority, and their influence. That's what I think they were talking about. And that's also based upon my experience in the Mandela Effect ministry, which we're quickly getting to. But one last thing before we get there. I also found out in the 1960s, there was an interview with a Dr. Richard Day from Planned Parenthood. And in that interview, and you can look it up for yourself, this individual said that it was the plan of who's ever in charge, is probably the Illuminati, or if you're into this sort of thing, you know that they go by many names, and there's very many different branches to the secret societies, and we'll cover some of them in future episodes. But here's the point. He said that they were going to change the Bible slowly at first, and the purpose was to bring the world into a one world religion. Now, if you've ever studied lesser or greater magic or sigil magic, or any of the magic arts, or the way that the modus operandi, right, of the Illuminati, the way that they do things, they like to call their shot first. And many say it's because it makes if they're casting a spell, it makes the potency of the spell much stronger because they told you about it first and you still fell for it. Now, others say that it has to do with some sort of karmic system that they live and go by, where it squares the game if they tell you about it ahead of time. But the point of the matter is that they did talk about this in the late 60s, Dr. Richard Day. I'm not going to play it right now because I want to get to the ministry. Fast forward a couple years, and I eventually decided to become a volunteer at John's Christian Fellowship, which is wakeuporelse.com. And it's a Christian fellowship focusing on the Mandela Effect, the Bible changes, and then bringing awareness to those changes to the church leadership, hopefully for the benefit of the body of Christ, which is a pretty heavy thing. I think at that time, I had realized how big this thing is, and I wanted to get in the game. I didn't want to just sit on the sidelines while I was and watch. It was just too big for that. I mean, we haven't even talked about the geographical changes or the changes to the human body or the name changes and everything associated with that. So it was decided that I would be in charge of contacting churches and setting up meetings with pastors so that John could speak to, have discussions with, or in some cases debate pastors who are denying the Bible changes. And little did I know what I was getting myself into. I knew that it was a pretty heavy thing, but I really had no concept of the extent, of the level of the intensity and the resistance that I was going to face, and the spiritual resistance that I was going to face. And it's one of those things where you have to kind of go through it. You have to live it in order to really be able to understand how intense and how severe it really is, and it really was. I learned that I can't cover the Mandela Effect exclusively. There are other things that need to be covered, yes, but the intensity of it, I need a break from it every so often. So this show is not going to be exclusively Mandela Effect content, but I will cover it because it needs to be covered. But we will take a break and we will cover other things that are important as well. So I started to contact the churches. And I'll tell you, the first thing that I realized is that it's like you're contacting these Fortune 500 companies, especially the larger ones. It's impossible to get a hold of anybody. I coined the term at that time, they're fortified fiefdoms. And to have a conversation with somebody is just like having a conversation with an answering service half the time. So I started to focus on smaller churches, and I started to use other means other than just phone calls, to get a hold of people, whether they be social media or YouTube accounts and things of that nature. And I started to have some conversations. I started at least to get people on the phone and have some conversations with pastors and leaders and members of the churches. Now, the results of those conversations, I could do a whole show on that, or probably several shows. And I will give some examples of some of the common things that I heard. But I think the key is the second thing I realized, and this is more important than the first thing, is that those that deny the Bible changes, there's almost always an element of dishonesty that's included in that denial, which I found very difficult to deal with, because you're supposed to be speaking to a church leader and they're not being honest with you. Okay, examples. What am I talking about? Well, you hear a lot of, well, let me look into this. This is really important. And regardless of what I find and whatever I discover, I'll get back to you. And then you can't get them on the phone ever again. You would think a church supposedly speaking with a Christian that wants to know the truth about this, that they would at least be willing to talk to you for 5 minutes, right? You also get a lot of platitudes, which I find to be an example of dishonesty. You get, well, God is not a liar. That's just an inapplicable platitude. It's I coined the term crisis of depth, because if you have a very shallow platitude that you use as an example to shut down the conversation, you're really not being honest. I heard a lot that, well, that would be saying that Satan has more power than God. And that's a straw man argument, because I never said that. And for the record, that's not true. Okay? The Bible says that greater is he that is in me than he that is in this world. And that's what I believe. That's what I know to be true. So Satan does not have more power than God. I never said that. And it's an inapplicable platitude. And if you try to have a more depth-filled discussion, you get shut down. See, I came to the conclusion, when you're talking to someone that has an agenda, okay, and their agenda is not the truth, you can't have an honest discussion with that person. It's like, you ever call a customer service rep and their boss told them not to give you a refund on something? You can make the most sense in the entire world, but they're doing someone else's bidding. And I came to believe the sum total of it is they're protecting their influence, is what it is. Now, you can say, and I have said, that if there were actually a church out there that would cover the Mandela effect and they would tell the truth about what's really going on about there, their doors would be packed. But there's a but. The but is that they would take heat. They would be persecuted. There would be people coming after them. And I think on some level, these pastors know or knew during these conversations that, boy, if I take this on, I'm going to take some heat. I'm going to take a lot of heat, and I don't want any part of that. And that's a really sad, scary thing. So I eventually decided, I was having so little success, I eventually decided to focus on speaking only with churches that had spoke about the Mandela Effect. There are Mandela Effect sermons out there. Most of them are very shallow. Most of them claim that it's not true. But you can find them. And I started calling pastors that covered the Mandela Effect in their sermons. Now, here's really gets really weird and really interesting. One of the first pastors that I got a hold of, Afshin Yagton, who is a pastor at New Covenant Baptist, I believe in Washington. By the way, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. His YouTube channel is Streaming Truth. Now, to make a very long story short, he eventually agreed to debate John live. And they did the debate on YouTube. You can find that debate on John's channel, wakeuporelse.com. You can also find it on Afshin's YouTube channel, Streaming Truth. And just a couple very interesting things about that debate. Some said that John didn't do a great job. I know from speaking to John that he feels that debates are probably not his forte. He might not be doing anymore. He really didn't enjoy it. But that's not the point that I want to focus on. Afshin. Now, here's a guy who, by appearances, seems to be like your proverbial Christian with a protest background, protesting the things that Christians protest. And it's been a while since I checked him out. You can check him out. It's not really that important, but the key is if you watch his body language in that debate, you really can tell a lot about Afshin because he's got a very feminine body language. That's been kind of a lost art in our society, right? That we can't evaluate people by the way they comport themselves anymore. That's like a no-no. Well, I will evaluate him by the way he comports himself and his body language. I think the study of someone's face is it's called physiology. And some say it's junk science, but I found it to be very reliable. But that's not even the most important and the most crucial part, because Afshin used a bunch of nonsense arguments as far as I'm concerned. I won't rehash all those arguments, but I will give you one example. There was a discussion concerning Revelation 1:13, and the King James Bible now says, and I don't even like saying this out loud, that's how bad it is, but it now says that Jesus was girt about the paps with a golden girdle. So the word paps means breasts, and in the Greek it's mastos, which generally means female breasts. And if you look at the context of every other scripture that uses that Greek word mastos, it always means female breasts. Further, there's another word for male breasts, which is the word stethos, I believe. It's the word that was used when John laid upon Jesus's breast, stethos. So Afshin tried to make the argument that that word, paps, does not mean female breasts. It could mean male breasts. And he left out all the information that I just shared. And of course, there's more to it than that. Again, I encourage you to watch the debate. But I could, maybe at one point, I will pick apart that debate and we'll go point by point. And in fact, you know what? I will do that. So that's going to be a future show. So we will do that, but we have to just continue. And I want to get to my point. So after the debate was over, I went on Afshin's Facebook and on Afshin's YouTube channel. And I reached out to him. I said, hey, X, Y, and Z is I feel that you're wrong. Can we have a discussion about this? And one of the people that came to his defense, listen now, this is starting to get complicated, but it's really important in understanding what's really going on out there. Her moniker is Standard Bearer. She's a member of Afshin's church. Her name is Wendy. Now, I come to find out that she used to believe in the Mandela Effect, and according to her, she repented because she realized it was a deception. Interestingly enough, she was the moderator of a debate that took place prior to the debate that I just described by two different people. Number one, Guy Fawkes. That's not his real name. He has a YouTube persona. He's got a YouTube channel. He's been posting for years on the Mandela Effect. I actually had a run-in with that guy. And I will possibly cover that in a later episode. But it's important to understand, I'm not sure about Guy Fawkes, even though he supposedly was on the good side. One of the tricks of the bad guys or the enemy in Christianity is like a false dichotomy or a dialectic, as they say. And you have Coke versus Pepsi, but they're both real bad. The good aliens versus the bad aliens, right? So that's what I think that they were doing. I still reserve my right to change my mind about Guy Fawkes. But the other person, listen now, in that debate was a pastor by the name of Sam Adams. Now, remember Scott Johnson and his ministry, which I recommended. I still recommend. Scott Johnson is not controlled opposition. He's not one of the bad guys. But guess what church Scott Johnson was a part of? It was the same church that Sam Adams is the pastor of now. And come to find out, before Scott came out of the ministry, he recommended Sam Adams for the position. And then Sam Adams turned on him and went to war. The Mandela Effect was one reason for that. There's other reasons for that too. There's a lot of connections biblically concerning the Mandela Effect. And if they deny the Mandela Effect, they generally deny other doctrines. An example would be Genesis 6. They deny that there were real giants and real angelic beings rather. They say that they came from the line of the sons of Seth. That's another whole show that we could do. And they also tend to deny the book of Enoch, which Afshin also denied in the live stream debate. So again, I'm just going to go over this real quick again. Afshin takes the debate. One of his main right-hand women, standard bearer, also known as Wendy, was the moderator. She was a former believer in the Mandela Effect. She was a moderator of a debate between Guy Fawkes and Sam Adams. Sam Adams is the acting pastor of an independent fundamental Baptist church. Now, to his credit, it's my understanding that that's a non-501c3 church. But it's the same church that Dr. Scott Johnson used to belong to. And they went after him when he covered the Mandela Effect. So here's my point. My point is that cast of characters, not including Scott. I know Scott was the member of the church, but his connection is that they came after him, not that he's involved with them. All that member of cast of characters, Afshin Yagtin, standard bearer or Wendy, and Sam Adams and Guy Fawkes are likely all connected. And they're all likely trying to control the narrative of the Mandela Effect. Now, I'm not 100% sure, to be fair, that Guy Fawkes is involved in this, but it looks that way, that's more likely than not. But we'll find out in time, I'm sure. And I do plan on finding that out. I will invite him on this show as well, as I'll invite Afshin on this show. I have emailed back and forth with Pastor Sam Adams. I will invite him to debate. I think he'll take the debate. It's pretty likely. I think there's a good chance Pastor Afshin takes it as well. So we'll find out some of the answers to these questions in time, hopefully. So fast forward again. And John had invited me to do some live streams on his show. And I believe a guest had informed me about a live stream denying the Mandela Effect from a conspiracy theorist live channel. The name of that channel is Coffee with Jesus. Vincent Rhodes is the guy who runs it. And he did a live stream with Dean Odle. Some of you might be familiar with Dean Odle. He is a flat earth preacher, a very well-known flat earth preacher. We will cover flat earth in a future episode for sure. And I've got a surprise there. I'm still working it out. That's going to be probably in a couple months. But anyway, they covered the Mandela Effect, and I watched the whole episode. Now, next episode, we're going to go over some of the arguments that he made in that live stream and in another live stream that he did, because they're about as bad and as shallow and as provably incorrect as you possibly can get. But that's going to take a whole show. We're going to do that next week, and I hope you stay tuned and you'll watch again, or you'll listen again, rather. But the point is, here's the interesting thing. The members of the ministry, including the moderators of his channel, were almost universally opposed to what he said. He couldn't get a consensus agreement. And I'm talking about in the live stream comments, in the comments on the videos themselves. And I've spoken to one of the moderators who's since quit the ministry. I'm going to have her on the show. I'm not going to use her name yet. I believe that she is sincere. I don't know if she would want me to use her name. Hopefully she'll be willing to interview on the show at some point in time. But the point of the matter is, I sent the live stream to John. And the first thing John said to me was, it's apparent they had to do this live stream. They were forced out into the open. So I started contacting Vincent Rhodes, and I started contacting Dean Odle. And of course, no response, ignore. I sent some comments on the YouTube channel. Hey, listen, we'd love to get together with you. We'd love to talk about this. Can we talk off the record? Can we just have a conversation? No response. So then I happened to see one morning that Vincent Rhodes was doing another live stream, and I happened to jump on his channel, and I said, hey, Vincent Rhodes, I've been trying to get a hold of you. How come you haven't gotten back to me about the Mandela Effect? And I'll tell you in about maybe 10 seconds later, who do I get a message from on Facebook? It wasn't from Vincent Rhodes. Guess who it was from? Dean Odell. Asking me what I wanted. And it was a short conversation. He eventually called me a deceiver when I told him I wanted to speak to him about the Mandela Effect, and he blocked me. I'm about 99% sure that guy's a shill, by the way. And if he's not, he is completely derelict in his duty to cover this properly. And his arguments are insane, and we're going to go over some of those next week. As far as Vincent Rhodes go, I'm about probably 95% sure he's a shill. And if he's not, then he is derelict in his duty. He is not doing what he's supposed to do. He's absolutely failed to lift a finger to look into this. I doubt that's the case. This is not a stupid man. So my point again, they couldn't cover it up. They had to, at least, they did something that I've come to call the nod. They nodded at it. Kind of like Paul McGuire did in a recent lives or a recent podcast that he did. We'll cover that as well. And then Vincent Rhodes actually did another live stream subsequent to that. And he did like a 2-minute video. We're going to cover this. He put a 2-minute video it had nothing to do with the Mandela Effect whatsoever. It had to do with Project Monarch, I believe, and mind control. And he put a title of the video of something like Mandela Effect Deception. And then the 2-minute video had nothing to do with the Mandela Effect. So the point of the matter is they can't cover it up anymore. And I don't think they're going to be able to cover this up much longer. Now, listen, I understand. Vincent Rhodes has a ministry that is in the margins. It is a conspiracy ministry. It's not mainstream. But what have we seen over the past few years? Many of the conspiracies that used to be things that the mainstream media or even the mainstream individual, Joe Sixpack will say, that they never used to be willing to touch, have started to seep into the mainstream, haven't they? So that's what's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So you can't cover up something like this forever. And I think we're coming to an inflection point. Now, next week, like I said, we're going to go over Vincent Rhodes' videos, and we're going to cover them point by point, and we're going to shatter his arguments into a million pieces. But before we get there, I just want to cover one other thing. Because if I'm going to do a show on the Mandela Effect, and I'm not going to mention this person, then that wouldn't be right. Kat, who wrote several books on the Mandela Effect. Okay, her channel is EYA censored, and she has to get banned and change her channel name all the time. What do I think of her? Because I have spoken to her. I don't know, friends, but we've talked, we've emailed. I've been on her show a couple times, and what do I think of Kat, and what do I think of her ministry? And the answer is I believe 100% that she is sincere. But I will say her ministry is so intense that I don't know if I would recommend checking it out for sure. I don't know following it every day. It's just so much. I don't know how she does it. And I think a lot of the people in the ministry are traumatized by the level of pressure that they get. So absolutely 100% check her out. Listen to her. She's sincere. She's not controlled opposition. And I would recommend her. It's just if it gets to be too much for you, take a break from it and then go back to it. This brings us to the conclusion of our show. That's a wrap for episode 1. Thank you for tuning in. We got some great stuff coming up. Next week, we're going to talk about Vincent Rhodes and Dean Odle, and we're going to expose their Mandela Effect denying arguments and the shallowness of those arguments. And a lot of them are straw men, and they're nonsensical, and we're going to dismantle them piece by piece. The week after, we're going to be talking about the Duluth model. Now listen, I actually believe this is the one conspiracy, the 501c3 church, they would touch the Mandela Effect before they would touch this one. The Duluth model is the prevailing legal framework that our family court system is based upon in every industrialized country in the whole world. And it's all about removing dad from the picture. We're going to tackle that. We're going to take that on. If you enjoyed the show today, please take a moment and leave a review, subscribe, like, share, comment. Let me know what you think. And we will see you soon. Again, thank you for tuning in.